Pac-Man and Super Mario are some of the most recognizable video game characters ever. 40 years ago, people were buying them by the millions, just like Sony TVs, Walkman players, Canon, Nikon, Fuji cameras, new Nissan and Toyota cars, and Nintendo game consoles. As you might have guessed, all of these brands are from Japan. Japan's economy was booming in the 1980s, and many thought Japan would catch up to America in another 10 years. But something went wrong. China became the world leader instead of Japan. Japan hasn't had an economic miracle in the past 30 years. The population is shrinking and aging, and those who invested in Japanese company stocks in the late 1980s still haven't gotten their money back. So why has Japan failed to become a world leader? Why did it lose its potential? And does the country have any prospects today? Right now, the top 1 most expensive companies in the world are American giants. But 40 years ago, the top 10 most expensive companies were all Japanese. Back in 1989, Japan was at the height of its prosperity. Banks were giving out money for practically free. You could get loans at 2.5% and mortgages for 100 years. The Japanese rich were living it up and setting records. Someone bought the most expensive diamond in the world for $6.5 million, a rare book for almost $6 million, and the famous Sunflowers by Van Gogh went to Japan. In 1989, Japan's Sony bought the American movie studio Columbia Pictures for $3.5 billion. That was a really big deal, but inside Japan itself, prices for everything went through the roof. For example, the cost of a square meter of real estate in Tokyo hit $1 million. You heard right, not an apartment, but a square meter. In the fancy Ginza district, that was the norm. How'd they get such a sweet life? To understand this, you have to go back a couple decades. At that time, Japan was all about adopting Western technology, of course, not for free. Here's how it worked. For example, there's the American giant DuPont. They were doing scientific research to create a new promising material, and that's how they came up with nylon. If you're not familiar with it, nylon is used to make women's tights, toothbrushes, strong parachutes, and even the American flag that was placed on the moon. DuPont spent 11 years and about $20 million developing nylon. So what does the Japanese company Toray do? Instead of spending 11 years and $25 million, they paid DuPont $75 million for the patent and started producing nylon, making at least $90 million from selling it around the world. That's good business. Other Japanese companies did the same thing. They bought a lot of patents and licenses, mostly from Americans. In 20 years, they got 15,000 of these technology licenses. They started making stuff in their own country, Japan, and improving and adapting the technology. So their products ended up being better than the ones they bought. The bottom line? Japan just flooded the world with cheap machinery, optics, cameras, and televisions. You can see how successful they were by looking at a photo of Panasonic's founder with everything his company was making and selling at the time. But what went wrong? Let's examine the data. What were the best-selling cars in the US in 1970? American, of course, Ford, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Dodge. Volkswagen added a little variety. And what do we see 15 years later? The same Ford and Chevrolet are still in the lead, but Toyota is already in 3rd place in popularity. Japanese cars are appearing in the top 10 more and more often. The same happened with other Japanese machines and electronics. In fact, Japan at that time was like China 10 to 15 years ago, a cheap global factory of everything in the world. But at some point, Western countries started to get nervous. The problem wasn't that they didn't like buying cheap Japanese goods. There was nothing wrong with that. The problem was that the local manufacturers were losing out to the Japanese year after year. This meant that people in those same states began to lose their jobs. In 1982, some Americans began destroying Japanese cars in protest. They were telling their neighbors, "Buy American." But here's an interesting point. The Western countries themselves were giving Japan technology and investing in it to keep it from slipping into communism, especially given its neighborhood with China. And that was fine with everybody. But as soon as it became unprofitable for the Americans themselves, everything changed. Listen to President Reagan in September 1985 criticizing these long years of seemingly beneficial trade relations.
When governments permit counterfeiting or copying of American products, it is stealing our future, and it is no longer free trade.
Not surprisingly, just one day before this fiery speech, free trade ended, at least for Japan. In September 1985, at New York's Plaza Hotel, yes, the same one where Home Alone 2 would later be filmed, New York's most famous hotel, representatives from the US, Germany, France, Great Britain, and of course Japan agree to equalize exchange rates so that everyone can trade comfortably. What does this mean? Imagine, The dollar is expensive right now. Is that bad? Well, on the one hand, it is good. It is profitable for the US to buy everything abroad, from Japan or Germany. But in that case, it becomes harder to sell American goods. Why buy American goods when you can buy them cheaper from others? There is an imbalance when you buy more than you sell, and that is bad for any economy. Logically, there are two options. Either weaken the dollar or impose tariffs on Japanese goods to keep local manufacturers from closing down. In the end, the two sides agreed to devalue the dollar to make American goods more competitive. But watch out! The Japanese yen began to rise much faster and higher than planned. As a result, Japanese goods were no longer as cheap and their mass sales declined. But the Japanese didn't seem to care. The yen was now strong and the local rich began to swell. They were even buying up American movie companies. Remember the story of Sony and Columbia Pictures? Now they could even buy Hollywood stars like Schwarzenegger to appear in commercials. But after 5 years of this unbridled financial binge, the Japanese economy inflated like a soap bubble. And then it burst with a vengeance, and the hangover of lost decades, as it is now called, began. Imagine a retail chain like our own 7-Eleven. Does the country need it? Of course it does. The stores serve an important function. They sell food. They employ hundreds of thousands of people who feed their families. Now imagine that such a company is $17 billion in debt. Does the country need it? And what to do with it? In such situations, the Japanese government decides to save such companies. For example, it starts giving them easy loans with low interest rates. Why is this? Because it's a shame to leave people without jobs, and the banks that lent the money don't want to be left without repayment either. If these companies close down, there's going to be a lot of trouble. But what does that have to do with zombies? The point is that these companies are like zombies. They are neither alive nor dead. Everything they make goes to pay off debt, not to development. And if there were only 1 or 2 such companies, it would be tolerable. But by 2000, 1 in 3 Japanese companies had become zombies. Why is it that even now, in 2022, when you read about Japan, you keep coming across articles about how the country still hasn't recovered from that crisis? Things are bad? Wait, how bad? Look how good Tokyo is. Sony and Canon cameras, Toyota, Honda, Nissan cars, they haven't gone anywhere. But here's a question. In the last 30 years, has there been a new Japanese world-famous technology company that has made a breakthrough with new ideas? Let's take a look at the list of the world's most expensive companies. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, they all took off after 1985 or later. Where are the Japanese companies? There is only one Toyota in the top 100 most expensive companies in the world. That's why the last 30 years are called the lost years. And what is the future of the country today? On the one hand, you can live a very decent life in Japan. Life expectancy there is one of the highest in the world, 85 years, along with Hong Kong. Japan's problem is that there are a lot of people over 65, 35 million people, almost every third person in the country. And the number of children has been declining for 40 years in a row. In the future, this could lead not only to zombie companies, but to a whole zombie country, because the younger generation will not be working for their own development, but to support the pensioners. Japan already has a problem of karoshi, deaths due to overwork. Every year, the government officially recognizes at least 200 such cases. On average, Japanese people work 80 to 100 hours of overtime per month and use at most half of their vacation time. Many young couples find it easier to have a dog than a child because it's too expensive. Despite all this, I'm sure that Japan will develop. For many countries, its level of technology and achievement seems unattainable. But I wonder, could Japan have avoided collapse? Let's look at today's China, the world's second largest economy. They too started by flooding the world with their cheap goods, and then improved them, making them better than those from whom they adopted them. But there is a difference. For Japan, the point of no return was not the crazy speculation of the late 1980s. That was only a symptom, not the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the Plaza Hotel Agreement. After it, everything went wrong. Could Japan have reneged on it and not signed it and sent everyone away, especially the US? Not likely. Tokyo was then afraid of losing the US market, wanted to stay under Washington's protection. Even if Japan had refused, the US would have simply imposed barrier duties on everything Japanese and trade wars would have started. Doesn't that remind you of anything? Today's China also faces duties and trade wars, but still controls its currency and economy. There is a feeling that China will avoid the Japanese scenario after all. What do you think? Let's discuss in the comments. At the end, I want to say thank you to everyone who likes, shares, and comments on the videos. It helps them to gain popularity. Thanks for watching and see you in the next episodes. If you like the video, don't forget to like and share it.